So, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Conversing Labs. I am your host, Paul Roberts, and I'm the director of editorial and content here at Reversing Labs. This is a podcast where we dig into the latest developments in areas like software, like malware, threat analysis, and software supply chain security. And I'm thrilled to welcome to today's podcast my colleague, our Chief Trust Officer, Saša Zdjelar. Saša, welcome. It's good to have you in the studio.
Thank you. We're looking forward to it. This is like my first one with you, Paul, on ConversingLabs. So I'm looking forward to this one and hopefully many more.
Is that true? We haven't had you on ConversingLabs before?
Yeah. First time. I think it's like this absolutely amazing brand and thing that we have. And, I think you do an amazing job at it. So I'm thrilled to be here and looking forward to doing more.
Oh, we're looking to have you. We're really happy to have you. So we're going to be talking about a couple things today. First of all, the issue of software supply chain risks and how that software supply chain landscape is changing. We just released our State of Software Supply Chain Security report for 2026. We're going to dig into some of our findings, and some of our predictions, just as important, predictions and recommendations for companies to deal with supply chain risk in 2026. Saša, you are particularly well suited to lead that conversation. You've got 20 years of experience working for Fortune 10 companies, global executive leadership experience, including serving for more than 16 years for a Fortune 1 company, also known as ExxonMobil, and then as a senior vice president for enterprise security and security assurance at Salesforce, another company people may have heard of. We're going to talk about it. You recently wrote a really interesting piece on Cyberscoop, talking about, this is an opinion piece, talking about this culture of move fast and break things that is breaking as we speak, and what maybe needs to happen in the wake of move fast and break things, what our new tech culture needs to be. So a lot to talk about, Saša. Maybe let's start by just having you introduce yourself to the audience and tell them a little bit about, the work that you've done, prior to coming on board here at RL and what you do here at RL.
Yeah, great. Saša Zdjelar. I'm the Chief Trust Officer at ReversingLabs, as Paul mentioned. And I've had a good bit of experience in very, very large enterprise. But I think maybe the piece that is pretty relevant to our conversation here is, I had the opportunity to see what this challenge, let's say software supply chain challenge, looks like from both a very, very large buyer and consumer of global technology and software, and then at Salesforce through a very, very large, actually the world's largest enterprise software producer or supplier of those technologies. So seeing kind of both sides of this equation, what it's like to have the accountability of bringing in unbelievably important business critical ERP platforms to run giant corporate value chains that basically run the company, and you're entirely dependent on someone else's software. So think platforms like, ERP platforms like SAP in the case of the oil and gas industry, where I spent a lot of time in energy, things like products from Honeywell, that run your refinery, so big platforms. And then at Salesforce, I would say that the real daily responsibility and accountability of knowing that, what we were shipping to our customers was, again, going to run in their environments in a highly privileged context. So whether that's, Slack, whether that's MuleSoft, whether that's any of the Sales Cloud, Commerce Cloud, any of the things that, again, makes a business function and work. So I've seen this challenge from both sides. And I would say until recently, or until ReversingLabs, put some solutions in the market, really neither side had particularly good tooling and technology to help them do this well. Up until now, we've spent a lot of time on a lot of kind of security theater or things in the absence of controls that we could do. And now luckily we have ReversingLabs capabilities to help companies really have a good actual control in this. But the space is not getting any easier. I know we're going to dive deeper into this over the next few minutes, but all you have to do is refresh the news. And it seems like every time you do, you see some new, Shai Hulud this or Notepad++, or, some new NPM package. That's a new worm that's included in, who knows how many software packages out there. So, this is not a problem that's going away. In fact, I think some of our state of software supply chain kind of reporting says that we have a significant uptick, in this NPM and other open source activities. So, I mean, this is a problem only getting bigger.
Absolutely. And in fact, you tip the hat to one of the things we're going to dig into right now, which is, this problem of software supply chain security. And you mentioned Notepad++. This was a story that broke kind of earlier this week related to Notepad++, which is a very widely used code editing application, independent. And it was the vector of an attack, very targeted attack on individuals, most of them in Vietnam, El Salvador, Australia, most non-US, apparently attributed to a Chinese threat actor. And really interesting how this played out. It is a software supply chain security attack, clearly, but it's a little bit different from what we're used to. I'd be interested in kind of your thoughts on the Notepad++ compromise, Saša, and what struck you about it.
Yeah, I think, so first of all, unfortunate that, the poster child that kind of started this conversation or that continues the conversation is Notepad++, because I think it's otherwise an unbelievably well-liked, super popular piece of productivity software for not just developers, but anyone that wants any kind of markup or organization to their note-taking tabs. It's a great product. So unfortunate that it's, in their context that we're having this conversation, but they were kind of the most recent, kind of compromised in this scenario. They put out a public statement about it. What might be a little bit buried in the story that people may not realize is we talk about all these under the umbrella of software supply chain, and it's a software supply chain attack and breach. But what this one to me uniquely highlights is, they could have been, and I don't know if they weren't or weren't, but they could have been doing everything exactly right in developing the software, right, in the CI/CD pipeline and code checking and static code analysis and SAS, DAS, all that stuff. They could have been doing everything perfectly and still have had this problem, because the compromise in this scenario was of the infrastructure hosting the updates. So what to me it says is, yes, you want, all the attestations that the vendors are doing things right. You want them to prove things. You want them to have verifiable builds and things like that. But, it's not a replacement for your own, maybe don't trust and verify. That and verify part continues to be unbelievably important, because, it was the compromise of the hosting infrastructure at the end, pushing out the updates, and in a very, very targeted way, right? 99 point, I don't know, multiple nines of the customers or of users of Notepad++ got the legitimate version. They got the good version of this. But a very, very targeted subset of people around the planet, because of this particular APT group's, kind of target profile, a specific subset of people were redirected to this nefarious or malicious build and got the bad version. So the key is, what could any company downloading this and bringing this into their environment, what can they do to ensure that despite the vendor making all the claims and doing hopefully all the things right, that still doesn't mean that a bad thing can't walk into your environment. So I think that's like the one unique thing about this. It was the hosting infrastructure that got compromised. It still led to, a supply chain compromise. So I think that's like one interesting thing. The second one that I would just highlight is, I think this is a great example of how talking about COTS or commercial off the shelf can be a great example of commercial doesn't have to cost you anything. Commercial doesn't always just mean when the procurement department has an invoice where they've paid money for something, right? This is still commercial off-the-shelf software because it's still someone else that developed it. It's under some sort of third-party license. You didn't develop it. You don't have the source. It's still COTS or commercial off-the-shelf software. So you need to think about that as well, that, oftentimes when we talk about, well, what's your strategy for COTS? I think people's heads, and mindset tends to gravitate towards those things where you pay something, there's a contract, there's an invoice. And that doesn't always mean that, right? It can be,
right,
highly, highly distributed, very popular productivity tools like this.
Right. And their inventory may hinge on going to finance and saying, well, just give us a list of everything, that we're licensing, that we're paying to license. And well, here's our software inventory. And it's like, no, it isn't. Right. And in fact, Yeah, so I mean, this is a free tool, might be widely used within your organization, but sort of invisible to you from a cost perspective. And then there's, of course, it's not even like the Notepad++ app is, necessarily compromised. It's the update infrastructure, right? That Notepad++, is relying on another vendor to provide. And in fact, when this first came out, and people were like, well, what are the IOCs? Notepad++ was like, yeah, we don't know because it's not our infrastructure. It's, it's our partner's infrastructure, and we'll get them to you when we have them, which was kind of like, okay.
Well,
what
I
ended
think
up yeah, go ahead.
Maybe the other thing that I would say is what this continues to confirm for me is that the binary is where the truth lives, right? All the other stuff before the binary is really good promises, aspirations, hopes, dreams, whatever. But the binary is the source of truth. It is what you ultimately got from that vendor, from all the layers: developers, imports, includes, builds, CI/CD pipelines, hosting infrastructures, third parties involved, distributors, whatever. The only truth of what you actually got from that vendor lives in the binary. It's the thing that you actually got. So it continues to be very important to be able to do binary analysis.
Right. And in this case, what happened was this update application, kind of bespoke update application that it used was compromised, was manipulated so that certain users, and this was targeted at individuals and certain organizations, when they went to get that update, they got redirected to a site that installed this malicious program. Rapid7 did a really detailed analysis of it. And it was basically a downloader. So what it was, they named it Chrysalis, but it was net new malware. It had never been seen before, clearly sophisticated and designed for persistence. How do you spot that as an organization? Because it's coming from a trusted source, right? Like you said, it comes down to actually doing analysis of that binary and being like, yeah, this is not Notepad++, or it is Notepad++. There's a whole lot of behavior in here that new, different, and malicious, right?
Well, I think what it's highlighting as well is that the overall trust model is fundamentally broken. You said, well, it's coming from a trusted source. I would say that concept of trusted something, trusted source, trusted vendor, if it still exists at all, I would say it's almost non-existent, but it's certainly eroding if it even exists anymore at all. I would say there's no such vendor. And, we used to be able to point at like some of the largest, maybe those who make our OS or, whoever, as like, well, they must have their act together, right? And pretty much all of them, I couldn't point to a single one that has not given us some reason to no longer believe that they can be trusted, right? So this concept of we trusted the domain, we trusted the update server, we trusted the hosting provider, every single one of these trust assumptions was exploitable. So I think that the general trust model is just fundamentally broken, and we have to get back to this concept of the thing you actually deliver to me ultimately, the binary, that is where the truth lives, and that is the thing I need to analyze.
And this problem of trust with supply chains is obviously, I mean, the Notepad++ in some ways was a little bit of an outlier in terms of how that attack was structured and played out. Yeah. Much more common are malicious or compromised dependencies or, things like that. And that's what, our most recent state of software supply chain security report came out in late January. This is basically a report that pulls together a lot of the data that ReversingLabs has gathered via our Spectra platform over the year, both on malware and software threats, as well as on software supply chain risks. Really interesting report and some very eye-raising discoveries. Top of that is, malicious open source packages, our detection of them via Spectra jumped by 73% in the last year. And almost all of that was due to a spike on the NPM platform. Obviously, one of the most widely used open source repos. Saša, I'm interested in your thoughts on that open source risks. A lot gets written about it. What are your thoughts on how well we're doing addressing this risk? Because clearly it's those threats are going up.
I mean, look, I think you just said it best for how well we're doing as an industry. I think the fact that, well, and there's some, I think there's some very interesting corollaries that we can take. So let's look at some of what you've mentioned. So I think, I don't remember the exact number, but it's like 70 plus, 72, 73% increase in malicious OSS packages. Again, the world runs on open source. We've heard that phrase over and over again. 100% true. The world runs on open source. The one minor disclaimer I'd put on that is, but your company doesn't. Your company runs on commercial packages. However, those commercial packages are full of open source. And where do a ton of open source packages end up? Used by commercial software. So the problem is one and the same. Now, I would say the outcome is not at all surprising. It's a very predictable outcome when you have an ecosystem that's built on implicit trust. So open source repos like NPM are essentially open door warehouses. Anyone can publish. The barrier to entry for attackers is almost zero. And one of the nastiest things that happens is you'll have an incredibly popular package by name that for whatever reason goes out of support, gets retired, and a bad guy picks up the exact same name and starts publishing nefarious packages, or they compromise a developer through social engineering, or they compromise them directly through their own login to platforms where they check in code. So I think that's one huge thing. Shai Hulud was also a watershed moment, I think, in the industry. It was a self-replicating registry native worm. It compromised, I think, almost either just under or just over 1,000 NPM packages, including some that have millions of weekly downloads. So like this incredible, this wormification of supply chain threats, I would predict is going to only accelerate. The other thing you mentioned is, NPM was kind of the big one. It accounted for, I think, 90%, again, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less, but that's also unsurprising. It's the world's largest software registry. It powers the most popular frameworks, JavaScript, Node.js, that type of stuff that is basically the backbone of modern web applications. And if you think about the blast radius, that is staggering. There are, I think, over 10,000 malicious packages detected in a single year. And that's in this past year. And that's more than double from the prior year. So again, the problem is only getting worse. The corollary I was going to say is, if you look at, I love analogies because I think they help me make something that may be a little bit abstract to someone a little bit more real. If you look at, what happened in the auto industry, when it also is, for anyone who's fascinated by this type of stuff, you might want to look, because it's fascinating that it took us like 40 to 70 years after cars were made, and you had these, 4 to 12,000 pound metal death machines moving around roads, sharing the roads with horses and pedestrians and humans and babies. It took 40 to 70 years before we said, maybe we should put guardrails or figure out how to do this safely. One of our other topics is move fast and break things. It's shocking that it took literally decades before people said, maybe it's time to have some standards around this and seatbelts and, things like that. Right. But my point is, what happened in that industry? You had this, is it getting better? Is it getting better? No, quite the opposite. It got massively worse before. And I want to say in the mid 70s, and it was actually, I think, one of the things we can thank Ralph Nader for, right? And at that time, a lot of the Highway Transportation Safety Administration, they introduced things over time. They were like, well, let's put in seatbelts, and then let's think about airbags, and let's think about crumple zones so that, when you hit, your hood doesn't go through the windshield and slice your head off. Let's think about road signs that break off instead of bend and become spears. Let's think about guardrails, on the side. Let's think about barriers that if you run into them, they're full of water or powder instead of something hard to absorb hit. All these
even
things.
Like the dials on the radio, they used to, impale people, and
absolutely,
and getting car makers to just make safer like radio
That's
dials.
That's it. So over time, as they introduced more and more of these things, there's these amazing charts. I actually made one like for a presentation 15 plus years ago that showed for every one of these incremental things that were added, you see the curve legitimately bending towards better, whether it was, traffic safety accidents that resulted in either, significant injury or death or things like that. So to me, it's going to take that sort of an effort, an effort to introduce over time significant guardrails, controls, and ways to move fast and, do it in a smart way. Right now we're, I think, at a point where we're still in for it getting a lot worse before it will get better.
Yeah. So, one of the things that we did see in the data that we collected was this, and you kind of mentioned it, this shift towards attacking very widely used open source packages and maintainers. Previously, a lot of these supply chain attacks were focused on, obscure little ignored packages. Maybe they had just, been abandoned or whatever, but they were still widely used. But that really shifted in the last year. We saw attackers going after some of the most prominent open source maintainers and some of the most widely used open source packages with literally hundreds of millions of weekly downloads, billions of lifetime downloads. If you were to talk to development organizations right now about how to sort of process that, because, there are so many people are using these packages. What would your advice be, and what would you say they need to start doing to compensate for that? Because we're, almost certainly we're going to see more of it, right? I mean, it's not like that's something specific to 2025 that's going to disappear in 2026.
Yeah, I would say, if the denominator were static, if it was, okay, now we know all of the problems and how bad it could be. Now let's think about how we tackle them. I would say if that were our paradigm, then we could have one kind of conversation. Unfortunately, even that is not true. The denominator is also shifting, right? As we have AI coming in, and as we have ML models being now a part of our development work, and as we have, things that did not exactly exist, a decade plus ago, which is things like dev tooling and VS Code. It's not just, is the code safe? It's everything from, the IDE, the extensions, the CI/CD infrastructure. It's basically a world where if you compromise the tool, you compromise everything that tool touches. So it's not just the code being gone after, it's any single thing that is sort of a weakness in the overall chain. So, there's a couple of, well-used or maybe now stale phrases in InfoSec that are like, why hack in or break in when you can log in, or you hear people say things like, hackers are like water. They take the path of least resistance. And I think that part is true. A lot of these are actual businesses. These nefarious attacker groups are legitimate businesses. They also are unbelievably efficient at what they do. They would much rather spend a lot less effort and money and resources by compromising the weakest thing instead of spending a lot of time and resources trying to brute force the login for something. There might be a much easier way to do that. So I think that's one, is like the whole dev tooling problem. And to your point about what would I tell developers is maybe start by looking at that first, looking at, again, your overall stack, your IDE, the extensions you use, your CI/CD infrastructure, what you're using, the marketplace, look at that. The other one is, and we did some fantastic research on this last year in Nullify, but the dangers that are now coming with using ML models and AI, that's an entire new frontier for supply chain that didn't exist before. So if you look at the campaign on Hugging Face, where there was malware embedded in the ML model using the pickle format, that's not a theoretical problem. That actually happened. So you hear people say things like, oh, be careful about, your AI model being poisoned or malware in that or something like that. People are like, oh, that's just fear mongering, or, that, how could that happen? And it happened. It legitimately happened. And it will only keep happening more. One, because I think it's not as well understood that it could, and that that's just another supply chain problem. In fact, an amplified one. But the other reason is, again, unless you have ReversingLabs, you don't actually have tooling that can help you find this. I mean, what tool would you point at an ML model that you're downloading to see if it has been tampered with or contains malware, especially as they're very, very large, complex files? The other one is, MCP servers. Now, it's becoming very, very, vibe coding and using MCP servers and, kind of stitching that stuff together. Okay, do you know that MCP server is an infrastructure that can be trusted? How do you know you're pointing at the one you actually think you're pointing at? So this concept of a malicious MCP server, we found those they were being distributed via NPM, and you have enterprises and individuals who are rushing to adopt AI. You have a lot of pressure from the business to do it. So now you have this is not a problem, which is another problem. My point around the denominator also shifted. You have even more things to worry about. So you have
we're reading now about the Moltbot skills compromise, right? Where you have these malicious skills uploaded, 600 of them, right? That, I mean, things are changing so rapidly, which is amazing. Like the capabilities of these AI platforms, Claude Code or whatever, it is just jaw dropping. And yet, the risk of plunging ahead, just kind of leaning into the cool features and not thinking about, well, hold on, like what level of access does this thing have to my data and applications and what's running on my system, my network environment? What is exactly in these, skills and other things that I'm uploading and running is really, I don't think we've seen anything like it in the past in terms of the risk.
The other thing is a lot of times these open source registries that we're talking about, the other thing that, again, maybe doesn't get as much press as it should is just how dangerous the amount of secrets exposure that's living in that land as well. We have everything from private keys, API keys, access tokens. That's probably 80%, if not more. But these are the keys to the kingdom, and they're being left in plain sight in public repos like NPM. And it's not the only one, but NPM kind of gets a lot of press because they're kind of the biggest ones. If you look at the Trust Wallet one that we wrote about in the Cyberscoop piece, in that scenario, Shai Hulud, leaked developer GitHub credentials. That led to attackers accessing source code and a Chrome web store API key, which led to the upload or inclusion of a malicious extension, which led to 8.5 or 10 or whatever the number was, $1 million being stolen. So like one secret exposure had this giant chain or linked set of consequences that are kind of hard to fathom. So I'll just go back to my original. I think the common thread in all of these is that the trust model is simply broken. Implicit trust in these open source repos and the update mechanisms and the hosting providers and developer tools, it's all being exploited. So the answer is continuous verification, but that means the ability to actually technically inspect the software.
Can we talk about the elephant in the sock, which is actually one of the chapters in our report? Yeah. The elephant in the sock is of course the risks that are lurking in the commercial software that your organization, whether you're a Fortune 100 or a local dentist's office, are relying on, whether it's locally run, whether it's cloud-based. As we know, just from reading the headlines this year, there are huge risks lurking in that software. We saw the compromise of F5. We saw the Salt Typhoon or Wolf Typhoon attacks targeting Cisco iOS. How many people out there are using Cisco hardware? I mean, 100% of companies, something like that. So how do you, what do we do about this risk in commercial software that we all rely on? And should it fall to the SOC to start taking these supply chain risks into their scope, under their umbrella, and saying, yeah, we got to manage these and monitor these just like we do endpoint network traffic and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think this is such a huge topic, not really being talked about enough, or at least in the right way. I would almost argue like we should maybe do a dedicated episode just for this on a future Conversing Labs. But if you think about commercial, if you think about commercial software being brought into an organization, when people hear software, their mind may not gravitate towards F5, Big IP, or Cisco, or things like that. Most of the time, right, what you're actually getting is a giant image. You're getting software that you run on a VM that acts as it's a software-based router or firewall or whatever. It's just software, but it comes to you in the form of a massive image or container or VM or whatever it might be. So massive that, again, there is no traditional tooling outside of ReversingLabs. I don't know of anything that can take this sort of 10, 20, 30, 40 gig package or more and make sense of it, analyze it, tell you exactly what's inside it, tell you what risks exist, not just vulnerabilities, but even bigger risks, malware, tampering, embedded secrets, all kinds of problems that are really, really bad. So, I would say the conversation we're not having enough about is, these sorts of products, and again, this is not to call out any specific vendor. It's any vendor like this used by a company. You said Cisco, Palo Alto, Versa, whoever a company might be using. I used to do this, like you said, a Fortune 10 company. I know what it took to get thousands of network devices, thousands, into 160 plus countries around the world. In some cases, it sat in customs for 9 months. These were multi-year and sometimes up to a decade projects just to get these capabilities into an environment. So imagine if you ever were faced with trying to replace one, like F5. They had the breach, their source code was exfiltrated. Now it's, many believe, kind of open hunting season on any net new vulnerabilities that are not yet known about. And so if you wanted to say, well, we want to change vendors or something like that, could you even do that? Is that even feasible? How long would it take you? There are some things that you bring in, you like a competitor, you swap it out 6 months later, a little bit of change management, you're good to go. Some are not. Some, like these underlying, I'll call them lowercase critical infrastructure. For any company, your critical infrastructure certainly comprises some of these giant network vendors that you bring in to do firewalls and software-defined networking and secure web gateway capabilities, VPN. These are very hard to ever change. In those scenarios, I would say far more care should go into the early screening and the ongoing monitoring of what's really inside these kinds of packages. So you mentioned a few that are a good example. VPN is another big one. There's been a lot of news. Ivanti VPN compromise. There were also Chinese APT groups that were targeting Microsoft SharePoint with 0 days. Like there's just these attacks on supply chain.
Citrix, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And then we have historic ones that put some of this stuff on the map. What was it? Circle CI, 3CX, SolarWinds. Like these go back, a decade or more, and they're only accelerating. So what does it mean for an enterprise? I would say if you're a supplier, if you're one of the vendors that are used by these companies, I would say you need to prioritize, securing your releases. Now, that doesn't mean just the traditional AppSec stuff, SAST, DAST, SCA. Yeah, you need to do all of that. That can lead to bad problems. None of that is, you don't get to stop doing that. That all still matters and is very important. However, as we learned from this Notepad++ and so many of these others, that is not where your responsibility ends. You could still ship tremendous problems outside of cross-site scripting that are far worse in the form of tampered piece of software or a backdoor or a piece of malware, none of which will ever have anything to do with SAST or DAST scanning or any manual pen testing. None of that will find it. So I would say you need to analyze that final compiled binary before you ship it. Because again, I'm going to argue that is the truth. The binary is the source of truth.
Right. I like this phrase, necessary but not sufficient, right? Yeah. So that's sort of the traditional AppSec stuff. Yes, absolutely got to keep doing it. Endpoint security, sure, of course. Network monitoring, absolutely. Is it sufficient? No.
Right.
Right. And we saw that. I mean, you brought up 3CX, which is kind of ancient history at this point, but I think of that 3CX desktop app compromise as a VoIP application, very widely used in the crypto industry, which may be what inspired that attack. But that was one where, the as we wrote on our blog, there were some real red flags in that compromised update from 3CX, signed update from the vendor, that if you had been looking for them, would have alerted you to the fact that something had happened, right? Was it a clear malware detection? No. Was it reason to dig deeper and be like, what's going on here? Yes. As it turned out, it started, setting off, EDR systems and stuff like that. And there was a bunch of days where it was really unclear whether it's legitimate, whether these are false positives on EDR. And so those are the types of scenarios that companies really need to be thinking about and preparing for. Okay. Let's talk a little bit just about some of our predictions for 2026 and beyond in our software supply chain security report. And I want to get your thoughts. Let's start with the SOX shift left prediction. Do you see that happening already? SOX starting to take on some of this supply chain stuff, or is that still, more time is going to need to pass before that actually happens? And I would say MSSPs might go into that as well, right?
Yeah, I would say with a lot of other trends, you see the most mature, well-resourced organizations moving into that space already. And then, like everything else, you will have early adopters, you will have quick followers, and you'll have kind of laggards. I would say this is one space where some of the things driving it. So let's go back to a few years ago, right? Several of us, myself included, had a very unpleasant holiday season around Log4j. And you know what that meant. And companies said, okay, well, that's a component. And so what is a component? Oh, that's this thing that's in your software. Wait, I thought all software was, people on keyboards typing software. Well, turns out that's not the case. Less and less less software these days is kind of first party typed or developed, and a lot of it is constructed. A lot of it is like, oh, someone already wrote a login routine, let's reuse it. Someone already wrote something for crash analytics, let's throw that in. So there's a lot of software construction that happens, and then some native software development. So Log4j, for a lot of people in the SOC, to your point, was kind of, they're not AppSec people. Those are not their backgrounds, or even developer backgrounds. They didn't necessarily understand what goes into the development of software. And so there was first this learning curve of like, yeah, there's this component, and SOCs were saying, great, where is it? Let's go. And they're like, well, here's the problem. We don't actually know where it is. So step one, SOC, go find where we have this. How would we do that? Well, the vendor sounds like they're going to have a script you can run, in a few days that will help you go look for this. And we had some of that with Heartbleed and a few others where like the SOC was kind of caught without capabilities, and you had to just kind of make it up, on the fly. So then they said, okay, is this problem is this a one-off problem, or is this a problem that we may see a lot more of? And I don't know of anyone who in that analysis concluded it's a one-off, we won't see any more of that. In fact, all the stats tell us we've seen a lot more of that, and we will see even more of it. So now the SOCs are asking, hold on, as part of our basic preparedness, response, playbooks, our native capabilities, for the next time there's a log 7Z, I need to not know where I have this. Like, how do I know where this stuff is? So I can go very quickly say, these are our 37 impacted systems, let's go patch, triage, quarantine, whatever. Well, then you have the advent of something called, SBOM, or software bill of materials. So something that can tell you what's in the software you're bringing in. So to your point about SOX shifting left, what we're seeing now, and in fact, multiple Fortune 1, entities that we're very well aware of and partnered with are starting to use these processes as part of their onboarding. They're saying software does not get into this environment until it flows through ReversingLabs, until it does its full analysis. Again, the source is the binary is the source of truth. And only when it's deemed clean or sufficiently clean, not perfect, but things we can live with, and none of the things we can that we can't live with, and we have a full software bill of materials. In other words, we have a catalog of this version that we brought in, and we will have an updated catalog of the ingredients list and exactly what's in it for every future version. Now, this is something we feel comfortable introducing into our production. So that's where I think we're going to see a movement of SOC shifting left, is they will just have more of a role in the initial screening and onboarding of software to fully understand what is in this piece of software bringing in. Do we have the tooling and capabilities to inspect it, detect it, monitor it? So I think that shift will definitely happen.
Okay. 2 more questions. Is that good?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. One of the other predictions for our software supply chain security report for 2026 was just about AI, and that AI is going to be driving software development, but also software risk. I'm not going to ask you to take on the whole AI, but I think my question for you would actually be, for companies, every company that is leaning into AI to accelerate development, product development, code writing, and so on. And you're very well informed on this. What are your recommendations to them as to, we talked about the Hugging Face stuff and the Nullify attack. What are your recommendations for them on how to manage the risk that goes along with the reward of, AI powered coding?
Yeah. So another topic I would say we should carve out a whole separate,
Yes.
episode for, because it's just such a massive space. I am not at all an AI doom and gloom person. Quite the opposite. I'm actually unbelievably, excited by AI and what it brings. But it also, like, we have to go into it with eyes wide open, knowing that it is also a massive new, maybe the biggest, because again, anything brand new, we don't yet have tooling, we don't have full maturity around it. There is no one that can say, I have 35 years of experience with AI. I'm sorry if you say that, you're just sort of lying. So, we're all kind of learning. Some people have a little bit of a head start on others, but like, we're all within a few years of each other as far as knowledge and experience. The whole space is new enough. So with that comes massive risk, just simply of the unknown. It is probably the single biggest new attack surface in any enterprise. This combination of pressure to adopt quickly and roll out quickly to not fall behind, because Acme Corp over there down the street, they're using it and getting all this huge value, so we have to have it as well. This pressure for fast, again, back to move fast and break things. I think history has taught us that we moved fast and we broke things. And I think the implications of doing that with AI are unbelievable. Unbelievable. Your own proprietary information getting into public models, making horrible decisions because you're relying on hallucinations and just completely made up answers. The entire truth that you're basing the responses on could have been poisoned deliberately in the model. How would you know? So I think there's tremendous reason to be excited. Tremendous, like unbelievable potential.
Yeah. Oop, we lost you. Switch your mic. I think your phone was. Yeah. Sorry. One second. Nope. Still can't hear you. Can you switch your mic to your computer? That might have to be our last question, Saša. Technology. Love it. Yeah, no, you're out. Okay. Okay. I think let's just give Saša another few seconds to see. Yeah, no. All right. I think with that, we're going to bring this to a wrap. And Saša, you ended on a good note. So thank you so much for joining us here on Conversing Labs. Like you said, we're going to have to do another one of these where we can just dig into these questions around AI, supply chain, and AI's benefit to security and also challenges facing security. So get ready to see an invite land on your calendar. And thanks everybody who tuned in. We've got more Conversing Labs episodes coming up in the weeks ahead. Stay tuned. And again, Saša, thank you. Check out, if you haven't, check out our Software Supply Chain Security 2026 report. There you go. And we will do that again. Talk to you later. Bye, Saša.
Thank you.
Yep.